Agora tá. Tem que tirar nosso som?
I think you just got live now.
Yes.
You have to mute you guys.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. So, I think we are live.
Okay.
Let me just check if you are really live.
I'm really live.
Before. You have to mute you guys. Yes.
Okay.
We are live with a little delay. Bye. Okay. Let's start.
So how do I know if the frame? Okay. All right.
So, hi everyone. I hope you guys are listening well. So we are here with Professor Stephen Peacock from the University of Hertfordshire here in the United Kingdom. And thank you all for watching us today. This conference is a cooperation between Professor Peacock and the research group ATV, em português, that is Grupo de Pesquisa Laboratório de Análise de Teleficção, do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação e Cultura Contemporâneas da Universidade Federal da Bahia. And I am Rodrigo Lessa, a PhD student in Brazil at the Federal University of Bahia, and I'm here working as a visiting researcher under the supervision of Professor Peacock with a CAPES scholarship. You all well know as Doutorado do Sanduíche. So let me make a quick introduction of our guest today. Professor Stephen Peacock works here at the University of Hertfordshire, where we are now. He teaches and researches film and television aesthetics and has published books such as Swedish crime fiction, novel, film, television by Manchester University Press, Hollywood in Intimacy, Style, Moments, and Magnificence, and Color. Today he will present his take on television aesthetics and style and share with us a little bit of his recent work on close analysis of TV series style, drawing examples from the American TV series True Detective and Twin Peaks. By the end of his presentation, we will have like 20 minutes for questions. So please post your questions on the comment box you see on the stream page, or follow the instructions you received in an email I sent you guys earlier today. So this is it. I'm going to move out of the screen. So please, Professor.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you today. And I'd like to say thank you first and foremost to Rodrigo and also to Maria Carmen and Ludmila and everybody at the University of Bahia for making this possible. And hopefully this will be the first of lots of collaborations between the University of Hertfordshire and the University of Bahia in terms of work on television aesthetics and the close analysis of TV. As Rodrigo said, I work here at the University of Hertfordshire as a reader in film and television aesthetics. I'm also now head of the media department at the university. What I'd like to do is present two papers, which were actually conference papers that I delivered earlier this year. The True Detective paper was delivered at Oxford University as part of the Film Philosophy Conference. And the Twin Peaks paper was delivered at the University of Salford in the north of England as part of their conference on Twin Peaks. Before we get there, I'd like to give a brief introduction of my work and my approach. And then possibly it's best, because of the format of the delivery today, if we save questions till the end of everything, and then hopefully there'll be time for me to respond to everybody. If we run out of time and you would like to continue to correspond about questions that arise from today's papers, then please feel free to email me. My email address is s.peacock@hearts.ac.uk. So that's s.peacock, Peacock, at hearts, HERTS.ac.uk. Okay. So first of all, my work is primarily in the field of film and television aesthetics. This was my training coming from the University of Kent under my PhD supervisor, Andrew Cleven, who himself was a student of V.F. Perkins. So there is a lineage in place of people working within the field of close critical analysis of television. I mentioned to some of you yesterday the idea that my work comes from a tradition which we can call expressive criticism. Expressive criticism is a form of writing about film and now television that comes from work by people like Victor Perkins, also famous critics like Raymond Dergnat, philosophers such as Stanley Cavell and William Rothman, and other writers like Robin Wood. There is a long tradition of expressive criticism within film, but not so much in television. I guess alongside someone like Sarah Cardwell and Jason Jacobs, I was one of the first people to test the approach of expressive criticism in terms of television and in terms of specific television dramas and moments of television. And that's an interesting experiment, and we might want to consider how useful the criteria of judging, interpreting, and evaluating film texts is when done with television texts. So that's where I come from. That sits differently in scholarship to the work of people like David Bordwell. I spoke yesterday about this, that David Bordwell is a formalist, and in television, that is the approach that's more often taken by people like Jeremy Butler. But that's not my work. My work, very simply, my work is the scrutiny of moments on screen. And it is a question of interpreting the visual and aural stylistics on a moment-to-moment basis in terms of their meaning and how the meaning might shift as the relationship between different stylistic elements changes. And from that small study, if you like, of a moment of television or film, we can then talk about the wider parameters of the film text, the television text, or the genre, or the narrative structure. It's a question of finding the word, or trying to find the words, to articulate your experience of what you see on the screen. I spoke with Rodrigo last week about a moment of entreatment, the drama entreatment, in which came from, my study of that moment came from an intuition, if you like, watching the show, that something very interesting was going on in a particular moment of the series. And the job of the expressive critic is to ask him or herself, what is at stake in that moment of television? Or as Stanley Cavell would put it, why is that as it is? Why is that as it is? And trying to find the answers to those questions, those seemingly simple questions, can be an extremely difficult task. but we persevere. I believe we're very lucky television scholars at the moment, because we are in the midst of another golden age of television productions. And I mean all over the world, British, American, and much further afield. We can think of programming such as Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, True Detective, Sherlock, Doctor Who, Luther, to name but a few of the dramas that are or have been on our screens over the last few years. And all of those aforementioned texts, in my opinion, would be worthy of close critical attention. It's worth noting that television aesthetics remains a small field, but it's growing. And the publication of one of my books that I edited with Jason Jacobs, Television Aesthetics and Style, reassured me when I gave out the call for papers that there was an audience and there was a community of scholars who were actively engaged in the work on television aesthetics across the world. And so it's a pleasure also to find places like the University of Bahia, where there is a critical mass of people involved in this kind of work. I'm just going to talk very briefly about my work in terms of my publications, and then we'll crack on with the papers. The first book that I published is Reading 24.
You want to share this one?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Okay, so the first book I published in 2007 was Reading 24 by I.B. Tauris. And I'm lucky enough to have Kim Acass as a colleague now. Kim Acass is one of the series editors of the I.B. Tauris Reading television series. And it's worth noting that we're talking about 2007, so it's not too long ago that books about specific television dramas were still rather rare. Now we have plenty of books, and it's become the norm to talk about specific dramas. At the time that Reading 24 was published, there were only a few books that dealt with the specifics, the details of a drama, be that in terms of narrative or style or genre or ideology or whatever. My first full-length monograph was Colour in 2010, which I hope showcases what can be achieved when we look very closely at a handful of films. There are only, I think, 5 films looked at in that book. The idea being that the first one has very limited colors in the film, and we move through to the last film, which has an extravaganza of colors. And the whole while, I'm trying in that book to develop a critical vocabulary about film color. And I guess the idea of developing a critical vocabulary is true to all of my work. Similarly, Hollywood and Intimacy came out the next year in 2011, which was a look at 4 films across the whole book, looking at how large-scale Hollywood productions could achieve, through the stylistic relationships within them, forms of intimacy. Then I shifted gear and became interested in looking at the phenomenon of Nordic noir, or Scandinavian crime fiction. And the outcome of that was 2 books. One was an edited collection on the Millennium Trilogy, which includes The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. The other was Swedish crime fiction, which looks at not only the most recent examples of Nordic noir, such as Wallander, but goes back through the history of Swedish crime fictions of this nature. Those are more traditionally television studies style books, taking a socio-cultural position on television and film and written texts. But I returned to the place that I'm probably most comfortable, which is television aesthetics, in the book Television Aesthetics and Style in 2014. So I want to give you a flavor of my approach and my work on television aesthetics by looking at a couple of shows. And the first is True Detective. There isn't a PowerPoint to accompany this, but hopefully you will have the series fresh in your minds, and in particular you will be able to call to mind the long take, the now famous long take that happens at the end of episode 4 of the first season of True Detective. And I hope you've seen it, because that is pretty much all I'm going to talk about for the next 10 to 20 minutes. Okay. I'm going to basically read the paper now. Characteristically, the makers of US feature films and television dramas who choose to use long takes often do so in opening sequences and at the start of episodes. I'm thinking here of Touch of Evil, Goodfellas, The Player, The West Wing, and Battlestar Galactica, to name but a few. Indeed, having been to the cinema last week to see the latest James Bond film, Spectre, it declares the opening through a long take on the Day of the Dead in Mexico, very pronouncedly. The immediate placement of these long takes acts as an assertion of intent as arrangements of direction and purpose. In the examples chosen, this self-assured stylistic technique develops our sense of the characters' powerful positions in their worlds. Its dynamic momentum matches that of the mafia, or Hollywood, or White House business, or the movements of James Bond, a conduit connecting camera and characters as they glide through spaces of power. For other works, the long take is the feature of the film, extended across the work's duration in films like Birdman and Russian Ark. By contrast, the one and only long take in True Detective's first season appears in the closing moments of episode 4, at the midpoint of the show's 8-episode run, and in a moment for the characters of scruffily handled violence. The central question that gave rise to this paper is the question of the device's centrality. Why does this long take come just here, in just this series? And what is at stake in its appearance? In two ways, the handling of this long take is striking in its lack of drama, in its lack of dramatic proclamation. As I've already said, this is the first and only long take in the show, and nothing that comes before prepares us for its arrival. Also, the introduction of the long take in this particular sequence occurs without any kind of fanfare. Rather, the stylistic change happens quickly and smoothly, and it is difficult to pinpoint, even after repeat viewings, when and where exactly the long take begins. So an often effortful filmmaking choice is presented without fuss. Further, because of its quiet arrival, the long take may only become noticeable to the viewer a way into its occurrence. This moment of recognizing a carefully orchestrated camera movement may or may not tally with the moment in the scene when the central character realizes that his plan has gone out of control. In the moment in question, Detective Rust Cole, played by Matthew McConaughey, decides unofficially to go undercover. As a test of the loyalty of his undercover self to the drug-dealing motorbike gang, the Iron Crusaders, Cole takes part in a heist led by Ginger. The gang pretends to be police officers, acting out a drug bust to steal the stash. As things go badly wrong, Cole is forced to turn to his partner, Detective Marty Hart, played by Woody Harrelson, to extract him and Ginger from the mess left behind. Here is a sequence then that hangs in the critical balance between showmanship, virtuosity, and skillful craft making. It is undoubtedly a visceral centerpiece to the series, but the long take's appearance and disappearance folds into overarching concerns. It makes sense for the show to move to this device just now at this point, beyond aspirations of critical flattery or the indulgence of a self-conscious technique. It brings to mind a few words by V.F. Perkins in his understanding of the long takes in Orson Welles' film, The Magnificent Ambersons. For Perkins, in The Magnificent Ambersons, the long take is not, quote, bigotedly imposed on the material, end quote. That comes from his book, his small BFI Classics book on The Magnificent Ambersons. So rather than a carnival ride or a stylistic trick, one long take fits organically with the designs of the show. At the same time, the very suggestion of coherence is kept in tension with the sight of things spilling out of control. The violent physicality of Cole dragging Ginger through the architecture of the moment contrasts with the meticulous pre-planned precision of a long take in action. We can also take a step back and place the long take sequence in the context of the series as a whole. And sometimes this strategy is useful to the expressive critic, looking for patterns or rhymes or counterpoints or anomalies within the larger whole. True Detective is a drama composed of and preoccupied with circles and straight lines. From the opening credits onwards, a visual pattern emerges of long tracks of roads, rivers, and concrete intersections. This motif is, from the beginning, combined with circular turns of the camera lens recording the two detectives' testimonies, of the time shifts from past to present, of the spiral symbol that is cut into the victim's back by the murderer. The dialogue reinforces these visual and narrative arrangements, with Detective Cole saying in episode 1 how a little detail somewhere along the line makes you say, ah, breaks the case. And the two detectives raising the idea that a similar murder is going to happen again, or it's happened before, or both. The inevitability of a return is also caught in Cole's alcoholism, as he admits that maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but I'm going to have a drink. And this is made complex by the character's belief that the self is an illusion, that we are walking merely hand in hand to extinction. Equally, settings and decor express dual notions of, on the one hand, circling, returning, and enclosing, and on the other, an inevitability of forward motion. Harsh vertical and horizontal lines dominate Cole's apartment. The two detectives repeatedly cross vertical strips of yellow police tape at crime scenes. A similar instance occurs as the detectives visit a suspect's house, and Cole's point of view is guided in a straight line out of the window to evidence hidden in a shed. So, with all these examples in mind, in True Detective then, there is always a looping back and a happening again, a looping back and a happening again, straight lines of action caught on a circular continuum. The idea is voiced often and loud by Cole when he says things like, "This place is like somebody's memory of a town," or saying to his police interviewers in the present, "Let's cut to the point. As the crow flies, you'll want to talk about that big takedown in the woods." The series joins the divide between episodes 2 and 3 by the camera continuing an arc from the former episode's last shot to the next episode's first shot, across fields to the Friends of Christ Church. It settles on a sign that says, "He will make straight your path." The long tape that closes episode 4 brings together these verbal and visual designs. It does so in one apparently continuous shot. The shot traces Cole's forward motions in a loop through the contained structure of the housing project. And whereas we might think that a single tracking shot will allow us to orient ourselves quite precisely in the sequence's architecture, the position of one house to the next in this sequence remains, even on multiple viewings, difficult to work out. It is one of many webs spun by the series creators, and the only one traced through in a single visual thread. While focusing on and emphasizing Cole's movements, the long take does not permit the isolation of the individual character in the frame. The arrangement of intimately connected bodily movements, of guns being turned on heads just now as the camera catches them, of hands slapping walls and hitting flesh, is part, for us, of the aesthetic appeal of the instant. For Cole, it is a messy equivalence of life's inevitable movement to nothingness, of us walking hand in hand to extinction. So just as the timing of the camera and the actor's movements in a locked-in long take expresses a lack of control in the narrative world, the character's actions are equally felt. Cole professes the illusion of the self whilst directing bodies in space, pulling people this way and that, in and out of danger. He embodies then a struggle to consolidate a sense of powerlessness with a sense of determination. It is a central achievement of the sequence and of True Detective to keep these seemingly contradictory impulses in the air together, embracing their complexities and overlaps, rather than settling them down. So True Detective's long take Siege enacts a battle between predetermined movements that are filmic, technical, spiritual, and moral. Through the circular turn and forward stride of camera and character, it expresses the problematic search for selfhood in an enclosed world of other bodies, bodies held together in a desperate choreography of survival. As Cole and Ginger reach Hart's car, True Detective ends the long take. A cut comes and the car darts away. The ground level camera work is also replaced by a bird's eye view of a police helicopter surveying the scene. Camera and helicopter circle over the events. Normally, in television and film fictions, particularly those of the police drama, such a shot would, in those dramas, such a shot would signal a sense of closure, resolution, or detachment. But in this instance, the camera and the helicopter do not release us or the characters from the moment's charge. The circling of the blades and the turning view of the housing project signals another inevitable revolution in this fictional world. Equally, while the cut, the edit, and the thrust of the car moving from the scene give us a sense of much needed delivery from the siege, they also comprise one more movement forwards. With a bundling of bodies into the same space, Cole's sensibility slams into that of Hart. This charged union between Cole and Hart becomes most apparent in the following episode, episode 5. On a takedown of 2 suspects, the detectives find themselves caught in another kind of labyrinth. Successfully chasing down one of the suspects, Hart goes to search for the other. Losing track of his man in a maze of buildings, Hart finds instead 2 terrified children imprisoned in one of the containers. Running out of the container and without hesitation, Hart walks right up to the suspect and shoots him dead. Like Cole's intuition that directs him to evidence, or his compulsion that drives him to drink, Hart can't now release himself from an inevitable outcome. Just as in the long take and in the final episode of the series, we are presented with a maze of spaces, another enclosed and enclosing circle, swirling meanings and leading in a single unbroken line to moments of overdetermination. So that's my take on the long take in True Detective. So we can now take a breath and turn our attention to Twin Peaks. And you'd be glad to know there is an accompanying PowerPoint to this bit of the talk, which I'll now get for you. Thanks. Can I do it like this? Okay, so now let's turn our attention to Twin Peaks. And I'm looking really at the first season of Twin Peaks. And we know that this may seem particularly timely as David Lynch has now finally decided that he will direct the 3rd series of Twin Peaks, which is rather uncanny when one considers that the final words that Agent Cooper says in the lodge in the 2nd series of Twin Peaks is, "I will see you again in 25 years. And 25 years later, we get the 3rd series. And this was the inspiration for colleagues in television studies at the University of Salford to put together an international conference on the first 2 series of Twin Peaks earlier this year. And this was the paper that I delivered at that conference. And you'll see on the screen there my email address again. So, one day the sadness will end, and it's about crying in Twin Peaks. Crying is a constant fascination in David Lynch's works, and Twin Peaks is no exception. In episode 1-3, the log lady asks, "What is this thing called a tear? Will this sadness which makes me cry, will this sadness that makes my heart cry out, will it ever end?" Across 2 seasons, central characters and minor players contribute their responses by bursting into tears of joy, pity, despair, or disillusionment. The first person to notice Lynch's fascination with crying is the film critic Michel Chion. His comments evoke a stream of tears in the films and television series and invite us to consider them more closely. Chion says, "Tears flow in all of Lynch's films, from Eraserhead to Firewalk with Me. Previously, only opera was allowed to make such abundant use of them. Everything about the phenomenon of weeping seems to fascinate Lynch. One might even say that he revitalizes its use for the screen. In particular, he shows how the welling up of tears, like a slow constriction, alters and convulses the face without drawing the body in its wake. Weeping is an on-the-spot convulsion. In Laura Dern's ugly grimaces, like a sobbing child over Jeffrey's infidelity, Grace Zabriskie shrieks at losing her child, and Andy Brennan weeping at Laura Palmer's corpse." This paper, the paper that I delivered earlier this year, seeks to extend Michel Chion's remarks by looking in closer detail at one of these works, at just Twin Peaks. And I've written before about crying in the works of David Lynch in a book edited by Michelle Byers and David Lavery called On the Verge of Tears. And in that book, I looked at Laura Dern as not only David Lynch's muse across 3 films, Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, and Inland Empire, but also the person to which Lynch will turn most often when he wants to scrutinize the act of crying. And for me, in that book, Laura Dern encapsulates what Chion is saying about a particular kind of performance around crying. And it also extends into words by Raymond Dergnat. Raymond Dergnat, a critic I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation as one of the great expressive critics, a British film critic, and his best book, by my understanding, is Films and Feelings, published in 1967, which has just been republished for the first time in a long time. And I would strongly recommend anyone interested in expressive criticism to go straight to that book, Films and Feelings. So Chion says, first of all, weeping in the cinema normally involves an isolated teardrop rolling down the cheek, which the camera registers fairly tactfully. In Lynch's films, however, the whole face contorts and becomes ugly, without even any signs of moistness, while the rest of the body stiffens. And I connect that expressionist understanding with words by Dergnat, that an expressionist film has a more dreamlike feeling, a sense of blurring and vagueness, of heavy but undefined emotion, which looms oppressively without being analyzed or explained. It has its own authentic pantomimic power. And then I can make the connection back to Lynch and say that Lynch's creation of dreamlike feeling, of pantomimic power, is apparent across his whole body of work. Lynch's world is a place of dancing dwarves, log ladies, and clowns. I also suggest that the act of crying places Lynch and places his work within the realm of melodrama, as we understand it by famous critics and scholars like Thomas Elcesser. According to Elcesser, melodramas, as we understand them from the Golden Age, such as Douglas Sirk's Written on the Wind, which is where the still on the screen comes from, Such films, according to Alcessa, often present a sublimation of dramatic conflict into decor, color, gesture, and composition of the frame, which in the best melodramas is perfectly thematized in terms of the character's emotional and psychological predicaments. What's at stake here is the idea of articulation. My argument in the earlier book, edited by Lavery and Byers, is that the closer the camera gets to Laura Dern crying, the less we know about her state of mind, which is an inversion of the ordinary melodramatic effect. There's something about crying that holds meaning in the balance with display. And this is expressed by Tom Lutz in another article from the book on crying. Lutz says, weeping often occurs at precisely those times when we are least able to verbalize complex emotions, least able to articulate our manifold feelings. We recognize in crying a surplus of feeling over thinking and an overwhelming of our powers of articulation by the gestural language of tears. It's my understanding that Lynch's films are full of a surplus of feeling over thinking, and this is certainly true too of Twin Peaks. And while there is a sense of the inarticulate, the mysterious inarticulate in terms of feeling over thinking, there are patterns that emerge in terms of crying across the first season of Twin Peaks that help us to understand the position and the purpose of crying in the world of Twin Peaks more clearly. As I said earlier, in terms of patterning, there are multiple rhyming moments of crying that allow us to understand and appreciate Twin Peaks in different ways. And two particular patterns strike me as most expressive, and that they are bound by matters of intimacy. So two patterns of crying bound by matters of intimacy. First, Twin Peaks provides many instances of intimacy which is broken by communication technology. Intimacy broken by communication technology, of people crying while on the phone, for example, or taking pictures or watching screens. And there are instances in the frame grabs on the screen right now. Then in contrast, and with Leyland Palmer in particular, there are moments of crying which encourages intimacy, encourages physical intimacy, encourages bodily contact. And many of these examples come together in the first episode, in the pilot episode of Twin Peaks. The first character to cry in the world of Twin Peaks is Deputy Andy Brennan. It's instrumental that Andy's tears swell while he photographs Laura's corpse. Then news of the girl's death spreads on telephones. Sarah Palmer cradles the receiver. Lynch's camera pans slowly down the telephone wire, as slow and long as the twin weeping waterfalls of the Great Northern. At school, Laura's classmates learn of Laura's death by the principal's voice on a tannoy system. And Donna can't help but cry as Sheriff Truman and Agent Cooper show her the video footage of their last picnic together. Dr. Jacoby, on the bottom right, collapses in floods of tears as he listens to Laura's voice on tape through his headphones. As I said, in contrast to this, Leyland Palmer is often framed in close physical contact with other people. As the sheriff breaks the dreadful news, Laura's father clutches to his shoulder, slumping to his knees, sobbing away. In the mortuary, Leyland hugs Truman and he can't let go. And even when not in contact with other human bodies, Leyland seeks out intimate objects to touch and hold. He presses his face to Laura's pillow. In episode 2, and in one of many instances of his dancing around and around, Leyland circles the living room with Laura's photo. Now, what's interesting for me is what happens in terms of crying when we discover that Leyland is indeed Laura's killer. It's difficult not to be moved by protracted scenes of Leyland in desperate tears. And we can see and make sense in terms of Twin Peaks. Some words by George Tolles here, another great expressive critic in terms of Mulholland Drive. Tolles says, our most honest questions for ourselves are likely to be, how did I believe so thoroughly what that character was doing? And what precisely did I believe? The revelation of Leyland's possession leads meaningfully to the idea that we have been at the mercy of a sincerity hatched at the very core of artifice. As early as episode 3, all of these concerns meet as the main players of Twin Peaks do at Laura's funeral. The sequence showcases Lynch's fascination with the human face in close-up. A muteness, respectful of the funeral, is interrupted by Bobby and James fighting. Slow-motion bodies come together and are pulled apart. This act of physical release serves to encourage Leyland's tears, and he suddenly throws himself down on Laura's coffin, and the whole thing goes haywire. An instant of soulfulness suddenly transforms into a darkly upsetting bit of slapstick business. The moment's motor is broken. As Leyland rides on the coffin up and down, we're suspended between laughter and tears. Once again, dramatic exaggeration accompanied by crying leads us into undefined emotion. So Twin Peaks then is a symphony about the mystery of communication. Weeping seems to be the mind communicating with the body about how it feels, but how often that feels exactly reversed, that we are struck by ourselves, brought attention to ourselves by the act of crying. In tandem, a concentration on crying in this series allows, I believe, for some of the central achievements of Twin Peaks to come to the fore. Thank you. So those are my 2 pieces of writing on True Detective and Twin Peaks. I hope you enjoyed them. And now we have some time left for questions. Do we have any questions?
No, not yet. I'm going to check now.
True Detective and Twin Peaks.
No. So, if anyone wants to ask some question for Professor Peacock, please post it as a comment on the streaming page on the right side of the screen, or follow the instructions I sent you on the earlier email today. But before to give them some time to prepare some questions, to send some questions, I'd like to ask a question just to keep the conversation going.
Okay.
Basically, how do you choose a scene or sequence to analyze? The 2 papers you presented have different methodological approaches.
Mm.
On True Detective, you choose a sequence and analyze it on its own merits.
Mm.
You let the sequence reveal what's important. But on Twin Peaks, you have a theme, the crime, and analyze several moments in different episodes, identifying patterns. So what's your thinking process when deciding what to include in your analysis and what to leave out of it? It's both a methodological question and a personal question. So I'm interested in knowing what's your thinking process when making the decisions.
Well, I'm glad you identified that I chose the papers today because they negotiate different ways in which we can look at moments. I think the idea of the study of moments is absolutely key to any form of expressive criticism of visual art in terms of film and television. In both instances, I was led by the moment, whereas it's more pronouncedly addressed in the True Detective series, True Detective paper, because the long take is a stylistic anomaly in that series, and it's obviously calling for attention. Although I'm making a claim that it kind of folds into the series concerns as well. With the Twin Peaks paper, it came from my initial viewing many years ago of Leyland Palmer in tears in the living room, holding on to Laura's picture, which was so profoundly moving for me as a personal experience, and confounded me when 10 episodes later we discover that Laura's father is the killer. So it really has to come from the work itself and from the moment itself. I try, and I'm not sure if I achieve, but some of my favorite writing in terms of expressive criticism comes from balancing an evocative look at the moment with a negotiation of the wider concerns of the film or the series or the genre, as I said earlier. But there's an awful lot going on at once in writing of this kind. You've got to clearly articulate a claim to the reader, to the listener or the reader. What is at stake in this moment? Why are we interested in looking at this moment in such detail? But then also you're trying to evoke the movement of the moment through your language, and then you're trying to make some kind of evaluative claim for its achievements at the same time, which is tricky to do.
Yes. So thank you, Professor. I have a question. Yeah, it's from Professor Benjamin Picado. You want to read it?
There's a question from Benjamin Picado that says, my question is on the status of style Professor Peacock departs from precisely, especially in its connection with its use in art history, for instance. And then I wonder if it's applicable to close reading of television in the same sense Michael Baxandall uses it. Well, Benjamin, I'm not familiar with the work of Michael Baxandall, unfortunately. However, two things. One, I'd suggest that style, and you're right to draw out a specific writer or theorist in terms of art history, because I would imagine that style is addressed in lots of different ways in art history. I can't answer that question directly because I don't know the work, but what I can say is that I recently edited an issue of a journal called Critical Studies in Television. And the issue is called The Liveliest Medium, Television's Aesthetic Relationship with Other Art Forms. And the drive behind doing that was a realization one day that television is not often talked about in terms of other art forms apart from film and the novel. An awful lot of television studies is concerned with television's relationship with film. We talk an awful lot, or some people talk an awful lot about cinematic television. We talk about adaptations of classic novels, but we don't talk about television's relationship with painting, or sculpture, or architecture, which is another reason why I would suggest that Raymond Dergnat is useful, because he does that in terms of film and architecture, etc. And we can hopefully learn something from that. So I'd suggest that anything that comes from art history that you find useful in terms of your understanding of television style, then that can be perfectly valid. I need to go and read some work by the theorist you recommend. Do we have anyone?
20 people watching.
Okay.
But no questions. So you will have like 10 minutes, and or do you want to finish now?
Well, I mean, people are more than welcome to email me questions. I'm happy to receive any questions on the work. There's a phrase that I've used before in writing that comes from F.R. Leavis, the famous literary critic from Cambridge University, where Leavis says, "This is so, isn't it?" Sorry, the best question that any interpretative piece of work should be greeted with is, "This is so, isn't it?" And the answer would be yes, but. The idea that, yes, this is all fine, but have you thought about this? And the only way in which we can work as a critical community and to refine our understanding of a piece of art, and I believe that works like True Detective and Twin Peaks are examples of television as art. The only way we can build that as a conversation is if people question or agree with particular interpretations. So please feel free to email me.
That's good. Professor Benjamin replied to the title of the book.
Thank you very much. Which patterns of attention? Oh, great. Okay. I'll certainly look at that book. Thank you, Benjamin.
So this is it. We are reaching our time limit. It's 7 past 2 p.m. here in the UK. So I'd like to thank you all for watching, and especially thank you, Professor Peacock, for giving us this so interesting hour of his time. And for me, particularly, it was very enriching. So I believe the people watching think the same thing.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me.
Oh, I just got one question. Would you like to take it?
Yes, let's have one last question. It looks like a long question.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Because some people cannot post on the YouTube page.
Okay. Let's have a, can I see it on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's start here.
Okay, a question from Marcel Vieira. Long shot, despite its history in the realistic film tradition, movies to nouvelle vague and other modern cinemas, has multiple uses in film and television dramas, opening scenes or the presentation of the characters, but they are not always self-conscious. Along with the use of depth of field and the flow of bodies in the space, the modern mise-en-scène used the long shot in a way to create a naturalistic staging, to hide the power of montage, and to emphasize the construction of dramatic time. into the duration of the scene from Tarkovsky to Aristotle. Yeah, in True Detective, however, the long shot seems to have different reasons, since it functions both as a mannerist, self-conscious use of style, as well as a dramatic turning point. Yeah, the end of the. Do you think it also has a hailing function, if we take in consideration the commercial and economic, as if the long take itself says to the spectators that it is not TV, it is HBO? That's a very considered question. Thank you, Marcel. Yes, you're right to describe the nuances of different ways in which film uses the long take, and that I, perhaps necessarily because of time, compress them together. And certainly there are lots of different inflections of usage and significance in terms of the long take. I query whether it's self-conscious as a use of style in True Detective, precisely because, as I mentioned in the paper, I believe from my experience of viewing it that the viewer is not made aware of it starting, and that we're not sure until we're almost halfway through, in my experience anyway, that we're in a long take. So we'd have to have a longer discussion, maybe offline, about self-consciousness, because it's very immersive and experiential, and doesn't interrupt, for me, the idea of experiencing a world. Whereas, say, in the Bond movie, it's very much a self-congratulatory use of style to set itself out as something special. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the idea that it's HBO, possibly. In terms of prestige, is that what you're alluding to? I just don't know. It's interesting to note, perhaps, that a very similar sequence happens at the end of episode 4 in the second series, without the strategy of the long take. That doesn't answer your question at all, but it's just interesting to look at. I'd have to look closer at that, but you've obviously thought long and hard about this, because you wrote such a long question. So thank you for your time.
Actually, I just heard that a couple of days ago that Professor Marcel Vieira presented a paper on the same long take sequence that you just like great. 2 weeks ago, I guess, in a film conference in Brazil.
Oh, I'd love to hear that paper or get a copy of that paper.
I will send you his email.
That'd be great.
So you guys can get in touch.
Thank you very much.
Yes. I guess this is.
Shall we say goodbye now?
Yes. Yes. So thank you, Professor, for taking this last minute question.
No problem.
So thank you, everyone, for watching. If you want to say goodbye for people from Brazil.
Thank you very much for listening, and for being there. And yes, goodbye, Brazil.
Bye.
Well,